This week on the Regenerating Nature podcast, we are talking all about food plots and how we prepare during the summertime with cover crops to create the most attractive, beneficial, and successful hunting plots come fall. We also talk about applying some of those same concepts to our pastures and just overall pasture management. I apologize. I'm tired. I have a migraine right now. So if at any point in time, if you're watching this, which it is on YouTube, if you're watching this and you see that my eyes look a little weird, it's because they are. Got a splitting headache right now. But overall, we're delivering a lot of really good information in this podcast. All that information is available on my website and Taylor's website, in the links to that stuff. It's in the description of this podcast. So enjoy. And as always, if you have any questions, please leave us a comment, send me a message, send Taylor a message, and we will get back to you. Thank you. Welcome to the Regenerating Nature podcast. In this podcast, we discuss and cover all things related to nature and how it directly affects all the elements of our lives. My name is Thomas Milsna. I am the owner of the Untamed Ambition, a private land habitat consulting company. And I'm joined with my co-host, Taylor Henry, a regenerative farmer and realtor. Taylor, it is 40 some degrees outside. Snow is mostly melted off, although it's pretty deep in some spots still on the north facing slopes. But how are things for you on the ranch these days?
We're doing well. I'm hoping that we have shut the gate officially on the winter water area. I'm using the above ground water lines now, and finally I don't know. We'll see how much mud comes from today, but I think we're a little bit drier than we were like a week ago too. So I'm hoping we're getting out of this mud life. It's been a rough month. It's been just a terrible March. Has been as bad of weather for cattle and animals as you could possibly like, and I'm sure the deer are just having a rough time too. But
yeah, massive temperature swings, and then obviously
yeah,
goes from warm for a little while, then cold and wet and snow and mud and yeah, all that good stuff.
What happened last week I think is like the biggest, just I think it's the worst weather on animals, is that where we had warm and it was just muddy. So like it'd be pretty hard for even a deer in the wild not to have mud on it and have mud all over its, hooves. And then you have a good rain, like I think we got a half inch. And then before you could even get dry by anything, it dips down into the 20s and then stays under 20 and got down into negative wind chill for 2 days.
Yeah. Yeah.
Atrocious.
Brutal. It's like everything turns to pottery real quick. All that mud hardens up. Even the trails, it's hard walking on the trails in the woods when they are all jagged, rough mud and then harden up. Everything's crunchy again. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that we take for granted when we're in climate controlled environment most of the time. And then, even if we're going outside and working outside, we can still come back and lay down in a nice, warm, dry bed, right?
Take a shower.
Take a
Use a
shower.
towel.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's brutal, but it seems like, knock on wood, it seems like we've kind of turned that corner. I mean, today is Tuesday when we are recording this, and yesterday was officially the first day of spring. So whatever that actually means. I mean, I remember not that long ago, probably 10 years ago or so, we got hit with 80-degree stretch of weather in March, and then it snowed.
2012.
Was that the year that and then it
Oh,
snowed
well,
like 12 inches at the end of the month?
No, that was probably that. I don't know when that was. I know in 2012, the average temperature was in the 50s for March.
Yeah.
And we had multiple days get over 80, but it also led to the worst drought in history. So I'm pretty sure like our area didn't see rain until midsummer. So it's also it's and I can kind of relate to that because 2 years ago we had a really, really nice spring, and that's also the summer that we had a bad drought. So I don't know if that's related at all, where if you have an early spring, it leads to, not as much precipitation, but I don't know. We'll see. As long as we can get, I know places like Missouri and that region of the country right now is starting to see green grass. So we're not far away, about 2-3 weeks away if we just have steady weather. But
Yeah, which, brings us to today's topic. Obviously, anyone listening to this, or most likely anyone listening to this, can read, so you probably saw the title, but we're going to discuss spring food plots or food plot plantings this spring, and pasture improvement. Very similar related topics as far as getting seed in the ground to produce a crop of some sort during this growing season. So, the mud and stuff, we talked a little bit about frost seeding. The muddy times, great time to frost seed in, but obviously if it's freezing. But now we're kind of shifting gears to planning for our warm season crops, either preparing for fall crops, fall food plots, or just getting our pastures improved and improving the soils across the board. I guess I'll let Taylor kind of lead on this with the pasture stuff. I know there's a lot more that you can get done in the pastures right now before that really greens up. The food plot stuff, we've got a little bit more of a grace period there because we're going in. At least I know I am. I'm going into mostly existing cool season cover crops that were planted last fall. So I'm waiting on most of my food plots. I wait until the soil temps hit about 60 degrees before I'm doing much planting. But we'll get into that in a minute here. Taylor, what do you have going on for your pastures and your pasture management? Are you doing any major improvements this year, or just kind of adding to them as you go?
well, my pastures that are already established, it'll just be bringing in red clover again, because the red clover biennial wore down towards the end of last year, which would have been the second year of its life. So I'll just overseed some red clover in certain spots. And then I'll actually mix in with that red clover seeding Timothy and some fescue and brome. And I'll probably start doing that. And I don't think grasses are the best thing ever to frost seed. I think you can get away with it with Timothy and maybe some others. But it's also, I'm a big believer in just throwing seed, especially when we're talking about perennial pasture. And really for the next week, it's still good frost seeding. Your lows are in the 20s, highs in the 40s for the next 10 days in the forecast. And that's a big thing too. If you're if you're overseeding a perennial area, do not, like, right now is not the time to be going out there with a four-wheeler and spreading seed.
No.
Just do it right away in the morning. You have like an hour, about 2 hours of daylight where the ground's still frozen. Don't make the mistake. I think that's my biggest rule on this farm, is days like today and just pretty much everything that we do, there's not vehicles allowed on the ground unless of emergency of some sort. And it better be pretty serious. It's just the ground is so sensitive right now that, and you have hours, in the morning that it's hard as a rock still, and you can get away with a lot of stuff. So but I see people still driving tractors out across the field like middle of the day.
Yeah.
And
If you're good,
it makes no sense.
if you're gonna drive out there, you can do so if you do it right away in the morning. I mean, that's
Yeah.
our farm. That's what they're doing is, they go out and they spread manure right away in the mornings. But then you said there's that cutoff, and then it's done. And, maybe some fields that have snow on them still, they can get in there a little bit later in the day. But even that's a little bit dicey because you break through that snow, and, some of that snow is on top of ground that was never frozen that hard to begin with. So it's a good way to rip stuff up and force yourself into a lot more work down the road to get those ruts smoothed out and reseeded down. And yeah, it's just a nightmare. So avoid that for sure.
And I think for pastures, I'll probably have some white clover in there too, just to mix in a perennial. But red clover is just a monster. I don't know if our area is just it does a lot better in, but red clover it is by far the number one performing seed that I saw, and I planted about probably around 20 different types of seeds when I did that first planting of the pasture. And red clover is the thing that just the amount of mass that it creates and the amount of forage it produces throughout the year. Granted, there's not any type of winter stockpile that you can use out of it, but geez, when it's middle of summer and your cool season grasses are kind of lacking a little bit, that red clover is amazing to have. And I think it's a great nurse crop for people too. Like if you want to do a perennial planting of something, even grasses, I think red clover and oats are a great option to have together. And because red clover, or plant red clover to kind of amend the soil a little bit and then come in for a fall food plot. And really with cattle, they will absolutely destroy red clover. So by the time that they get through a paddock that's heavy with the red clover, the areas of red clover is complete mat coverage on the ground. And you have about 10 days where that new seed can have a shot at getting established before the new growth or the regrowth from the red clover starts. I just think it's an awesome plant.
And you see it last 2 years, a solid 2 years.
Yeah. Towards the end of last fall, it wasn't as great. Similar to, I mean, truly like extremely similar to chicory. The chicory is another one that I'm gonna throw into the pasture more, just because chicory did so well in my food plots. And the chicory is an interesting plant. Like, so it has two different life stages, right? Where you have like the stem that flowers and it looks similar to like red clover maybe, but then we also get the leafy forage, right, from chicory. So is that in two different stages of its life?
Yeah. Trying to remember now. It takes a
Because
couple
I'm
years
thinking
for it to
like,
mature. Because the
yeah,
first
like the
year it's
first
more of a
year
leaf.
you have the big leaves, and then it
Correct.
must reseed itself or something, because then the second year of chicory was pretty much all flower and stem, and not as much of the like the thick leaves that you think of as a food plot.
Correct. And that's when it
Um,
would reseed itself, is when it actually creates a
yeah,
flower. That's the reproductive organ of the plant, right? So yeah, the first year you get, and if you have it in a food plot or something where you're mowing it, then it'll just kind of phase out, because I think it is a biannual plant. But if you let it go to seed, then it'll reseed. That stuff's everywhere. I
I
mean, you
don't.
see it in the
It went to
ditch.
seed at my place and it didn't work. It didn't like really reseed itself a ton. Like I'll probably broadcast some more over in there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I'm
and
not sure how viable.
the cattle don't really eat those flowers and stems as much. They'll kind of chew them down a little bit. But the amount of bees and butterflies that are interacting with those plants is, I like chicory a lot.
Yeah.
I
No, it's
suppose there is a threat of it kind of getting out of control. I mean, it is all over the road ditches, but we'll see.
yeah, it's certainly not a native plant by any means. But it's, like you said, it's already all over the place. So I mean, and for those listening, if you're not familiar, I mean, the chicory, but it's kind of like a bluish
Yeah,
purplish kind of flower, more
yeah.
blue than purple. Yeah. So no, that's a good mix. I mean, there's a lot of wildlife food plot blends out there that have chicory and clover and such in them. I mean, I've kind of steered away from those perennial plantings over the years, more annual plantings, even clover in general. Now, most of the time when I'm cross seeding clover, I'm doing an annual clover, like a crimson or a balanza or something, where it's determinate based on the weather conditions. So it'll grow really well throughout the summer and then die off at the cool season in the winter time. So we don't have to worry about that taking over the plots by any means. But our whole food plot program kind of relies on cycling those cover crops, or whatever you want to call them, a cover crop or an actual crop that the deer are feeding on. So it works out pretty well. But Taylor and I last week, we skipped a week on releasing the podcast. So anyone who was holding their breath, I apologize for that. But March is a really busy month for me. I've got 2 more shows coming up this weekend and the following weekend. I'm the vice president of a local sportsman's club and I run a banquet that's coming up this weekend too. A lot of running around. And on top of that, I'm trying to get all my client properties ready to go, prepared for the spring season, food plots, tree and shrub plantings, and wrapping up some logging projects and all sorts of stuff like that. But Taylor and I last week we actually went and sat in on a Midwestern bioag seminar, luncheon, whatever you want to refer to it as, with Gary Zimmer. And he's a organic farmer in Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin. I forget how big his farm is. It's pretty big, 1,000+ acres. And he was or is milking around 300 head of dairy cattle on top of that. So it was interesting. We're always trying to learn as much as possible about producing the highest quality, on the nutritional side of things, highest quality crops and forage across the board. And Taylor and I are both big proponents of no-till. And I think a lot of that actually comes just from where we live. With the topography around here, it's such a high risk when you turn the soil. If you get a heavy rain, which obviously when you're sowing seed, you're hoping for rain. So it's kind of that double-edged sword. But Gary, on the other hand, is a big proponent of light tillage. Is that accurate to say he would refer to it as the light tillage, where he's basically just scratching the surface? But his main program, or at least my takeaway from his seminar, was he, even when they're, I guess you could call it cash cropping, if they're pulling corn or beans off of that ground, they essentially give that field or that land a full year of rest with a cover crop before they come in and plant something where they're actually pulling a lot from the soil and harvesting it. So it was interesting. I mean, our food plot programs are fairly similar, and I push really hard for no-till, but I'm fully understanding of the fact that most guys out there don't have a no-till drill. So I'm always looking for other ways, or the next best option, so to speak. But his food program, or his forage program on his farm, was very interesting. You have anything you want to add to that, Taylor?
Yeah, I mean, I think his topography makes a big difference. I think he's dealing with a lot more bottom kind of flat land area. If you know where that region is, it makes a little bit more sense that he would be able to get away with tillage. I don't. I. With that being said, the people who are doing it here, if they just followed a method like his, it would be a good solution.
Yeah.
Because it's true crop rotation, and then with an idea that we're feeding the soil and feeding the biology in the soil as much as we can. And I think the only thing, I'm not sure what his animal integration was. I don't think he really talked about it much, but he's a true corn farmer, soybean farmer, and it's like he's doing exactly what most people are. Actually, I think he kind of said that they're phased out of soybeans, didn't they?
Yeah, for the most part.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, he's doing exactly like what our whole area really is, where it's a lot of dairy farms and a lot of people farming corn. And it's just, he did highlight some of the issues with the cover crop stuff, where, the rye and how do you get a market for it, or where do you take it? The market just isn't as prevalent as you would like to see for people to just do it in masses. But yeah, I think it's interesting. His favorite crops are rye and oats.
Yeah. Yeah, and he highlighted the benefits of both, and both of them are very good at pulling nutrients up and bringing it to the topsoil in general. And then obviously the cover crop aspect of that, where it's protecting and shielding that soil all the time.
And the
So
only time he tills is for corn.
yep. Yep.
So they're broadcast seeding all of that 700 acres or something.
Yeah. Which is insane, doing it with a side by side. Yeah.
With I have the same seeder that they had on the back of theirs. It's called a herd seeder. It's easily the best broadcasting seeder available that I found for UTV. It's
What's the
expensive. I think
what's the pattern on that? How wide of a swath does it spread?
I'm not sure. I think you can adjust it. I'd say I need to adjust it a little bit this year because it's a little bit too low to the ground. I'd like to get it raised up. But yeah, if you're looking for a really good broadcast seeder, the herd seeder, the problem with them are they're not super easy to order. Like they're not in normal stores, and they're pretty expensive. I think I ended up paying like 800, 850 or something for mine,
Wow. Yeah,
but it works. Compared to what you get, it's amazing.
I've got I don't even know what brand mine is. Some cheaper like ATV spreader that I modified to make it mount to the back rack of my ATV, but I actually want to switch it to the front rack so that I'm getting that seed out there before I run anything over. Yeah, it's interesting. Uh, Back to the cattle or animal integration side of things. I I don't know, he was grazing a fair amount, but I know he said that he composts all of his manure now and then spreads it.
Yeah.
And by doing so, it lowers the acidity of that fertilizer, and then they have less weed issues. So that makes sense. But yeah, it's not always easy or feasible to run cattle everywhere on every crop, and it adds a lot to it. But obviously, anywhere that you can do so is a huge benefit. So, but no, it was interesting. That was a very interesting talk. A lot of good takeaways from that in general. But
Well, and we're talking about volume. That's, I think, yeah, like you said, over 1,000 acres,
yeah, and
and
productive.
it's spread out. Yeah,
Yeah, what did he say? On average,
like a 30-mile radius, I think.
he's profiting like $500 per acre.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a big thing, is like not just focusing 100% on yields, but profitability, right? That's really what it comes down to at the end of the day. And obviously, productive system is more profitable. So,
And he
but
threw a couple jabs at Gabe Brown. He essentially was saying that he doesn't believe in no-till because of the compaction, which that is an issue with no-till for sure. There is compaction issues. Um, I would assume Gabe Brown is having success with the method that he's using. I think it takes time and patience if you were to go no-till and then trying to eliminate chemicals of any sort. But um, I
yeah,
can
and
see both
obviously,
ways.
obviously it all comes down to the context too, right?
Yeah.
What are you actually trying to produce? If you're mostly grazing and doing, light harvesting, or if you're harvesting a crop where you're not on a specific timeline where you can get in there and harvest it when the conditions are right, then you can avoid a lot of those compaction issues. Like our farm, for example, you're talking about like chopping corn silage or something. Now you're going across those fields with heavy trucks, semis, big chopper, and if it rains a little bit, it's not like you're waiting a week for it to dry out. You got to get it.
Yeah.
You're waiting a little bit, but uh, that's you don't always have that flexibility, so it's understandable. But you know, I think it kind of just comes down to there's the fact that there is no silver bullet solution or absolutely perfect system. It's just kind of keeping in mind those soil health principles and focusing on everything you can do to improve the soil health at all times, and not try to avoid negatively impacting the situation as much as possible. But again, there's no perfect solution all around. And that kind of brings me back to the food plot side of things. It's always trying to find different solutions that work, because for me to explain like the best case scenario to one client and then tell them that in order for you to achieve this level of food plotting, you're either gonna have to hire someone to do this, or you're gonna have to go out and spend $20,000 on equipment to do it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's not feasible. So there's options. There's plenty of options, but again, just kind of focusing on those soil health principles and doing the best that you can. That's a good head start, right? Especially given where we've come from and the conventional practices being used.
Well, I think it's just being aware of the biology. he, no matter what he ever says, he's talking about biology, and just having a general understanding of what takes place underneath the crop. I think is probably the most important thing, because people wouldn't do a lot of the weird stuff that they do if they were thinking of their crop being the soil.
Yeah, which is one of those things that obviously it makes a lot of sense to you and I, right? At this point. But I don't understand how more people can't grasp the concept of where that actual nutrition that's getting in those plants comes from, right? That it doesn't just come out of thin air. Parts of it do, some of it literally does come out of the air, but that nutrition and the transfer of those nutrients, it all comes from that biology in the soil. And by biology, we just mean life, right? The life in that soil. That life in the soil is directly responsible for putting that nutrition into those plants and maintaining healthy plants. And like you
But
said,
we don't have the measuring tool for nutrition yet. So
no.
they're basing most people base success or failure on bushels and the amount that they harvest, and that's just coming from the fertilizer.
Well, we do have measuring tools for nutrition, but it's not that easy,
Well,
right?
they're not
You have to do a
if
forage analysis, and it takes a lot of time and all this stuff. It's not, yeah, not something that can be measured real time, so to speak.
well, that is the answer though. Like at some point, if we get a tool that can be as readily available and as simple as knowing how many bushels you got per acre, that would be the solution. I think that would just change people's viewpoint, because it's a pretty simple. I think a lot of this just comes down to people have made it a little bit too simple. I mean, the process is relatively simple, but people have tried to make it overly simplified for farmers, because it's just, you buy this amount of seed, you put this into the ground, you spray these things on it, and then you get this amount of bushels, and then that's what you get paid for. So it's a little bit too simplified.
Yeah, agreed.
The most simple system it all comes back to is, and I think you can kind of figure out with people's diets, but like, how much could we just get away with just eating more meat? Like, just there's so much that goes into this stuff. Like, you could just let it all go and it will grow grass, and we could just be eating a lot more meat. And especially when you start looking into like the carnivore diet and stuff, where people can really survive, if not thrive, on like 80 to 90% of their diet coming from just beef.
Hey, man, it makes sense to me. I mean, that's the conversation I have all the time with my wife, who she has a twin brother who's a vegetarian, and nothing against him. It's his choice, and he's not like anti meat production, anti hunter type vegetarian. It was just a health choice that he made years ago and kind of stuck with it. Still eats a
Mm.
ton of eggs, and so he's getting that protein and some of those healthier fats through the eggs and such. But yeah, it just doesn't make sense, these vegetarian based diets. Like that's not a natural thing. If you live in the northern hemisphere, especially the northern half of the states, it's not sustainable to live on vegetables because they wouldn't be available to you most of the year. And meat and all the vitamins and minerals and stuff that come with consuming organs and the fats and stuff with animal products, that's very sustainable. And yeah,
Mm.
it blows my mind every time I read an article or watch some video about someone who had all these health issues that were mitigated or completely eradicated just by switching their diet to an animal-based diet.
It's
But
almost like the cure-all.
it
It's
is,
like,
but it's completely against everything that everyone tells you, right?
yeah.
And that's the problem. I mean, that's a big problem globally right now, obviously, when you have these global elites that are trying to push specific diets and all these other regulations on the world to fit their narrative and pad their bank accounts, when the solution is right in front of our eyes and it's super simple, right? Like what you said, the healthier the land, you have more animals integrated into these food systems, and we're getting more of our nutrients from these animals that are being produced off the land But again, those animals have to be produced off the land and not produced in a feedlot, and the land producing grains to feed animals in a feedlot, because that just doesn't work. So yeah, no,
Well, you
it's
have to produce the grain then, and like it's just when it all comes back to like everyone's just it's so like we're just fighting the system by producing grain. It
yeah,
just seems,
yeah,
like, and we don't get that much from it. Like obviously corn does a lot of cool things. Like it's a I talk a lot of smack about it, but it obviously is it's an important crop. It does, it's an option for fuel. It's a lot of things, but it doesn't need to be the number one crop. Like it just doesn't. Grass should be the number one crop. It is the most sustainable thing. Just allow the ground to grow what it wants to grow, and then put things on it that eat the stuff that grows out of the ground, and then we eat that stuff. And it actually is really good for us.
like I said, it seems so simple. It is simple.
It
It really
is.
is.
It is. It is. And guess what? The government could just, I mean, could you imagine this if the government would cut down on all the money they spend for mowing road ditches, and just every time a new road got put in, they would put up a high tensile fence along that road, and we would just whatever the normal whatever you should be away from the road, and then we're grazing just the maximum amount of area too,
Yeah.
because the biggest thing is just fencing, and time I guess is a concern for people, but I don't know.
Well, the fencing thing that's an interesting topic, right? I uh I did this habitat camp class a couple weekends ago, and one of the attendees in there, actually, it was the oldest gentleman in the room. He had a lot of good experience to share. I'd bring up topics, and you could tell that he hadn't really thought about these things before. But then once I started to talk about them, he always had something to add to it. He's like, those. Now that you say that, situations, this is my experience with that. On the
Mm-hmm.
fencing note, he mentioned, and I brought up the grazing cattle to manage grassy areas on your property. One of the things I talk about in that holistic land management seminar I do is how unproductive it is to mow grassy areas. It's one thing to go in and maybe mow your pasture periodically after the cattle graze it, but and
That's the
yeah,
key point there.
but to entirely mow like a CRP planting year after year after year, it's unproductive. You're not producing anything. You just have a byproduct, which is, the emissions of that tractor, and then obviously all the inputs that come with owning the equipment or paying for the equipment, maintenance, yada, yada, yada. But he said his property, he fenced his entire property in and pastured it very lightly, and it dropped his taxes so much that he saved $4,000 a year.
Hmm. Well, a lot of people do. I don't have a lot of experience with that, but a lot of people do talk about that.
Yeah.
It's like,
Well,
yeah, I fenced in my property and got a couple cattle just for tax reasons. And I
yeah,
guess I don't know any
absolutely.
different because I've always just
Well, you can take
had egg
you can,
taxes, but
yeah, because that's exactly it. You can take your recreational property taxes that could be $50, $60 an acre down to $2 or $3 an acre when it's zoned as an agricultural property, right?
yeah.
So, and his point was that he paid off those fences in the first year and then basically made money every year after that if you look at what he was spending. So that's a big thing. And that's, MFL, managed forest land, I think is a decent program, but you can't graze it. That's a huge negative. Even CRP is a pretty good program, but CRP is essentially just resting the land. It doesn't improve the land in any way, shape, or form. And then even with CRP, you're only allowed to graze it every 3 years, which you should be allowed to graze it every single year. And if there's just certain times of the year that you're grazing it, or if if you have a good responsible management plan in place where you're not heavily grazing the whole thing every year, then you're still allowing lots of structure, lots of nesting habitat for ground nesting birds and so on and so forth. So there's a lot better ways across the board that we could be managing our land. I certainly don't have all the answers, but it's obviously something that I deal with on a daily basis, and I'm always looking for ways to improve it. But having animals integrated into those systems, and deer obviously bring a benefit to that system, but they don't have the same benefits as large hooved animals like cattle or buffalo or woolly mammoths, right? So I
Well,
guess woolly mammoths,
you can't like concentrate the impact either.
correct.
I mean, they're wild for a reason.
Yep, yep.
I do have a funny story about my cattle this last week, though.
Let's hear it.
Well, it's funny now because everything worked out fine.
Yeah.
So, one of the muddier mornings, I'm filled this tank that's like relatively close to the buildings, is where we buried the 6-foot line out to the hydrants, kind of like in the middle of the whole property. And they were out this ridge where I could kind of see them sometimes, but sometimes I would lose sight of them. So I went out in the morning. It was still dark because I needed to get to an appointment. And I checked the water. I'm like, oh, weird. They didn't really drink that much water last night. So I just walked back. And on the way back, I'm like, that was kind of weird. I didn't see them. Well, whatever. Like, I didn't look close enough, I guess, because it was still like dark. It was just getting light. So I jump in my car, start driving down to my meeting. And luckily I took the road I did. And I get like my property is kind of like surrounded by woods on the southern side of it and the eastern side of it, and there's a road that travels down a valley that borders it as well. I drive down that road, and like to the bottom southern fence line of my property, there's a bunch of shit in the road. And I like almost kept driving, like there's just no way, like they would never, I've never even seen it, they've never even gone into the woods before unless it's for a shade place. Like whenever they've gotten out before, they kind of just hang out not far from where they, get out. And I drive down there was shit down the road like 100 yards. So then I'm like freaking out. I'm like, oh my God, they're like in town. They were like heading to town. So I drive like all the way to town quick, and I see no more shit like after a little while. Whip back around, drive back to my place, jump on the UTV, zip out there, and I have 15 cattle just standing at the fence, looking back in, being like, like trying to get back in. So what they had done is they had pushed a little hay bale, what was ever left of it, onto the fence, and then must have like slowly just been feeding on it, and all of them slowly just walked out of the fence, and then they must have eaten the hay bale down far enough where the fence popped back up, and they all just standing there being like, what the hell? Can't get back in. So they went and like hung out in my deer like food plots, and it was kind of cool because then the next day I went through and like followed all their tracks and like what they did and found where their beds were for the night. And they bed just like freaking deer. Like they bedded like down in this ditch, right on the edge of the woods, facing out towards the field. And then they walked. They never like ventured away from the road. So I have like ATV trails through the property. They just walked those. And it was so annoying to me too, because at one point I saw where they turned right to follow a road. They get like 20 yards down the road, and there's a little log across the road. And they almost just sat there and looked at it and then just turned around and followed the road the other way. And that's when they headed towards the bad road. And they followed just a deer trail out to the road, came out to the road, obviously, for a little bit, and then got pushed back into my woods, followed the deer trail, got back up on the road, and then just ended up back up where they were supposed to be by the morning. Unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad it ended up that way and didn't end in an all-night pursuit of dark-colored animals running around, dodging
it's just
cars.
Dumb. Like, I just think first step you should have when you buy a property is perimeter fence.
Yeah.
Around the whole property. And right now I only have about 30 acres fenced in, and it just needs to. It was just stupid because they're in a back area where there isn't perimeter around it. So it was that dumb. Like they just pushed a hay bale onto the fence, and then I mean they're so stupid. Like they respect those one line hot fences so much, like because I know they were out of water. I'm sure they were thirsty. That's probably why they went wandering, and they actually went down to the creek and got a drink. But and that's probably what made them go down to the woods in the first place, because they couldn't get back to their water. But yeah, it was an interesting situation to say the least.
Yeah, well, it ended well. So like you said, it's funny when you look back. Doesn't always end that way.
It is. It's only the third. It's about the fourth time, and this would be the third spring grazing that they've bounced out of where they're supposed to be.
Yeah, that's not so bad. Not so bad at all.
No.
All right. Well, let's talk about food plots, right? Anyone listening want to kind of give them some tips, help them plan, at least go over how I'm planning food plots this year. And I say that talking about both my food plots on the properties that I hunt, and then also all the client properties that I manage and the properties that I put together habitat improvement plans for. So, obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you understand that we are trying to do everything we can to get away from chemicals, the chemical dependency. I try to make it very clear to my clients that I'm not 100% anti-chemical, although it seems like every day that goes by, I lean more and more in that direction. But I still look at chemical usage as a valuable tool in our arsenal, when it comes to improving habitat across the board. But I do think, and I know from experience that once you establish habitat, it can be managed without chemicals. It doesn't have to be part of your annual routine. And food plots are no exception to that. And I think that's the biggest thing is when I mentioned chemical free food plots to clients or potential clients, they kind of roll their eyes. It's always the easy factor or just the fact that they've never really heard of any other way of doing food plots aside from using chemicals. So I wanted to talk about that briefly on here and hopefully set all the listeners up for a successful year. And, like I said, establishing chemical free food plots. But before we do that, I'm just going to run through the 6 soil health principles relatively quick. And I'm going to present them in the order that I present them to clients. And keep in mind that this is related more so to food plotting than just, farming or the general practices. They're all the same. I just kind of group them differently. So of the 6 soil health principles, and why are these important? Well, healthy soil equals nutrition. That's where the nutrition in those plants comes from, and nutrition equals attraction. So in a simplified way, the healthier your soil, the more attraction you're going to get on those food plots. So the first soil health principle is know your context, right? We have to understand the context of the situation. If you're trying to grow a crop in an area where that crop's just not designed to grow or evolve to grow, I should say, then it's just not going to work. And in order to make it work, it's going to require a significant amount of inputs. And it's just not going to be a productive system. The example that I like to use when I'm talking to a client is we live in Wisconsin. We could absolutely grow oranges in Wisconsin if we wanted to, right? With the technology we have these days, but it's completely out of context and it's just not going to be productive or efficient by any means. So understand your context, from the crop you're growing, the site conditions, so on and so forth, even the time of the year that you're trying to plant a specific crop. Second soil health principle is minimize soil disturbance. And this is the big one, right? We have been so conditioned to disturb the soil every single time we rotate a crop. I mean, that is the go-to food plot routine. One day I, just out of sheer curiosity, I Googled who invented food plots. And I think it came up with like Whitetail Institute or something. And then I Googled Whitetail Institute's recommended food plot planting program. And they are very, I guess I call it conventional in what they recommend, which is the spray till spray method. And when I say minimize soil disturbance, we're talking mechanical and chemical. So now they are coming in and saying chemically disturb, mechanically disturb, and then chemically disturb that soil repeatedly. And what they're trying to accomplish there is they're trying to essentially sterilize the environment so that there's no competition when you put their seed down. But we know, if you're listening to this podcast, and by now too that we're big on soil health, and we know that there's more living organisms in that top 2 inches of soil than the rest of the earth combined. And those organisms, that biology, living animals, those living organisms in that soil are directly responsible for the nutrient cycling that produces healthy plants. So you need to minimize soil disturbance. Now, we just talked about Gary Zimmer talking about light tillage. So even when he does his light tillage, he still has very good ground cover, which brings me to the third soil health principle, which is protect and cover the soil at all times. So even with light tillage, if you have a good cover crop on there, you're still going to have pretty good ground cover, but you are disturbing the soil. So the fourth soil health principle, as I present it, is maintain a continuous living root or living plant. And there's many purposes for that, right? The biggest thing there is protecting that soil from erosion. So protecting and covering the soil and maintaining that living plant kind of go hand in hand in my mind. You're trying to protect the soil, keep it covered, and also hold that soil in place to ensure it doesn't erode away. I saw a video the other day of probably one of the, well, arguably the most popular outdoor brand or outdoor marketing company right now. I'm not going to name names, but they were talking about how to produce the best green food plots. And as they were discussing their food plot program, all you see is a tractor going back and forth and this food plot in the background and dust flying everywhere. If you see dust behind your tractor, that's erosion. Probably one of the more common forms of erosion, right? We all think that erosion means that the rain washed away that topsoil and cut some grooves in the field, but the reality is that dust is carrying away topsoil, precious topsoil. If you take the thickness of one piece of paper, one printer paper off of an acre of land, that's about the equivalent of 1 ton of topsoil. So when you see dust blowing around behind your implement, you're losing topsoil. So keep that in mind. Again, keep that soil protected and maintain that living root, and you won't have that issue. And that UV exposure is very, very damaging. UV light's one of the most effective sterilizers that we know of. So by exposing the biology in the soil to UV light, you're not only losing moisture when it's desertifying that soil, but you're also sterilizing and killing the beneficial organisms and bacteria in the soil. So keep it protected. On that same note, we're talking about wildlife food plots here, right? We're either trying to attract animals to an area for aesthetic purposes, right? I work with property owners that don't hunt. They just want to have a lot of wildlife in their backyard, birds and bees and butterflies and deer and all sorts of good stuff. Or we're trying to attract wildlife for hunting purposes. So along with maintaining a living plant or root, you really don't ever want to clear that table. The big thing that I try to focus on client properties is creating consistency. We improve bedding areas, but we also have diverse habitat, diverse types of cover, from good thermal bedding cover in grassy areas, and also thermal bedding cover in more open, closed canopy areas, more open vegetation wise, where you get good airflow through it on those hot days in the summertime, and then thermal bedding cover in the grassy areas where the sunlight can hit the ground, but the wind can't rip through it. So it's a nice warm area in the wintertime. So when we have that diversity of the cover, we hold deer on the property more frequently, more consistently. And then with our food plots, if we have consistent food there year round, then we're creating consistent movement through those areas, which is a lot easier to put together a pattern or pick apart a routine on a specific animal and target that animal. And it just improves your hunting situation all around. So maintaining that continuous root or that continuous living plant keeps the table full, or always has something there for them to eat. So that's the fourth soil health principle. The fifth soil health principle is increased diversity of both plants and animals. And the sixth principle is integrate animals into that system. So they kind of go hand in hand. The more diverse the plants are in that system, the healthier the system is going to be, right? If you have certain plants in there that pull certain types of minerals or nutrients from the soil, but they also put other things into the soil, and we have that diversity in there, then those plants work together. They work really well. Along with that, it comes back to the minimizing disturbance. When you don't disturb that soil and you allow that biology in the soil to thrive, specifically that mycorrhizal fungi, that's going to allow those plants to actually connect to each other, communicate with one another, and transfer those nutrients in real time. And they've proven, research now has proven that plants can communicate and actually heal each other or send signals to each other to ward off pests and so on. So it's very important to not disturb that soil, but it's also very important to have that diversity in the soil to begin with. And then that animal integration aspect that we talk about frequently on here, when you integrate those animals into the system, they're an essential part of the system. Every part of a plant is utilized by an animal, some type of animal at some point in time. It might be a dead plant being broken down by insects or that biology in the soil, or it might be a live plant where the most palatable nutrient dense parts of that plant are consumed by larger herbivores or birds that eat the seeds or whatever it might be. And then obviously those animals digest that part of the plant and convert those nutrients and put a fair amount of them back into that system and feed that biology in the soil. So those are the 6 soil health principles. Again, anything that you can do to follow those principles is going to be a win. It's going to improve your situation. So I always present those to my clients. But another thing that I bring to the table, or I try to make them aware of without sounding too much like the anti-chemical, anti-corporation type of hippie that I'm slowly becoming, is just trying to make them aware of the chemical side effects that we are aware of, or that are potentially there. And this is, I'm reading straight from a handout that I hand my clients right now. And I have a note in there after the soil health principles that says important info. It says all chemical, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, etc. are poisonous to something in the system. Use them sparingly and with good intentions. And then I have a whole page about herbicide use and applications in this handout that I give them. But the key point there is that the soil is a system, right? And soil is a living system that produces the plants or feeds those plants. So when you spray herbicides, you may be spraying a very specific type of herbicide, but there's always a trade-off there when you're essentially spraying a poison to target or kill something in that system, whether it's a type of plant or a type of pest or a type of fungus. It's still poisonous to that system in one way, shape, or form. And that brings us to the glyphosate topic. And again, I'm not going to sit here and beat a dead horse, but there are some things that we know about glyphosate without a shadow of a doubt. And one of the very important things that I think everyone should be aware of is that 10 years before glyphosate was patented as an herbicide, it was patented as a mineral chelator. So it bonds to minerals and makes them unavailable, bio-unavailable. So they're no longer available to that system. Then obviously we know that it's a broad spectrum herbicide and it affects all plants in some way. So there's glyphosate resistant plants, but all plants are affected by glyphosate. And there's a trade-off. Your GMO crops are generally anywhere from 20 to 40% less nutritious due to that glyphosate aspect of it. The other thing that we know about glyphosate is that it's a patented antibiotic, and it's actually owned by a pharmaceutical company. So if we know anything, or if we've learned anything about pharmaceutical companies over the last few years, that's it. I'm not going to say any more on that topic, but it's an antibiotic. So it does affect the biology in the soil. It kills good bacteria, and by doing so, it actually encourages or promotes the growth of bad bacteria in the soil. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing that we know about glyphosate is it's a known bioaccumulator, which essentially means that nothing breaks it down in the system. So it just builds up. It builds up in the soil. It builds up in plants. It builds up in the animals that consume the plants that have the glyphosate in it. So keep that in mind. And lastly, another thing that we know about glyphosate and most other herbicides, pesticides, and fungicides is that they lower the soil pH. So they increase the acidity of the soil. So what does that mean? Well, typically when you have a lower soil pH, there's more weed growth. It encourages weed growth. And then also it requires more inputs, because if you're continually spraying and lowering that soil pH, then you're going to have to go in there and add lime to bring that back up to a more neutral standpoint, so that the plants that are growing in that soil can actually harbor the nutrients that they need. So that's something that I try to make everyone aware of. Again, I'm not 100% anti-chemical, but reduced chemical use does produce a significantly healthier and more nutrient dense system. Which brings me to my next point.
Not yet
Not yet.
anti-chemical.
Yeah, not yet. Like I said, I'm getting closer and closer every day. But that being said, the food plot system that I run and that I educate all my clients on, it's going to require some form of disturbance initially, right? So year one, there's going to have to be some form of disturbance. So you're either going in there and terminating the existing vegetation via tillage or via herbicide. And what I try to get my clients to understand, or I try to get them to think of herbicide use as a credit type system, right? If you approach the situation and go, okay, I'm only going to allow myself to apply herbicide 2 times and that's it, then you generally are going to plan a little bit better, and you're going to have a little bit better timing with your approach, and you're going to be a lot more productive with it. So when it comes to weed control, and that's the biggest question, right? When I say chemical free food plots, everyone's like, well, how do you deal with weeds? Well, the system itself deals with the weeds if you follow these steps. So year one, it's going to require some type of initial soil disturbance and termination of that current vegetation. And if you understand the timing of that chemical usage, and also when you're planting these food plot blends that I'll get to in a second here, that's going to maximize germination of whatever you plant, and that's going to automatically reduce the weed competition. So year one, it's going to require some form of disturbance, but understanding that timing when you plant, understanding the chemical use, those are critical aspects of it. But you should also understand that every time you disturb the soil, be it with a chemical herbicide or with tillage, you're going to promote more weed growth, because those weeds are there for a purpose. So year one, it's going to require that disturbance. The next thing is always have a cover crop going into fall, a cool season cover crop, something that's going to grow. Again, it's going to maintain a living root. It's going to grow throughout the cool season, throughout the winter, and it's going to continue or commence growth as soon as things warm up again the next spring. So that's an important thing to consider when it comes to weed control in your food plots. The third thing along the lines of weed control is you have to forget conventional aesthetics. If you ignore this conventional concept of aesthetics where you have to have this crystal clear monoculture food plot, everyone loves a nice clean brassica plot or a nice beautiful bean field. If you get that out of your mind, you're going to have significantly better food plots right off the get-go, right? Again, weeds are usually there for a reason. And the term weed it's a relative term anyways, right? Really, when we say weeds, we're referring to native plants most of the time. There are going to be some obnoxious or noxious weeds that show up. Thistles and cool season grasses actually are probably some of the hardest things to get rid of in those plots. But for the most part, weeds are native plants trying to heal or protect the soil. And their seeds are generally very small and easily outcompeted. So if you have good ground cover, a good thatch layer on your soil, a lot of times those weed seeds can't even produce enough energy to push up through that thatch layer and get sunlight and continue growing. But the key point there is those weeds are there for a reason, right? Why do we see weeds in a bean field or a cornfield? Well, it's usually because we disturb the soil with a chemical and we tried to clear out the area between all the rows, and now you have this open spot. So those weeds are either trying to protect the soil, create some ground cover, or there's a nutrient deficiency in the soil itself, and those weeds show up there and are trying to improve the soil. Dandelions are a perfect example of that. If you get a lot of dandelions in your lawn, it's not, I used to think this way all the time. It's because, I didn't mow my lawn, and some of those nice bright yellow flowers turned into those puffy seed heads, and then it blew all over the place and spread all these seeds. Well, that's not really the case. That obviously promotes it, but that's not the reason those dandelions are there to begin with. The dandelions are generally there because your lawn is low in calcium, and dandelions are very good at harboring calcium from the soil. They have a deep taproot that can mine down, pull that calcium up into the topsoil. So that's just one example, but every weed out there can tell us exactly what's going on with the soil when it shows up. But if you're planting a diverse seed blend, eventually you'll weed out the weeds, pun intended. You'll weed those out just by having that diversity in your blend where you're amending the soil every time you plant that diverse blend. So if you have some weeds the first couple of years, don't overthink it. Just roll them down, terminate them the same way you're going to terminate your cover crop, and keep moving forward. And along with the conventional aesthetics is understand that nature is three-dimensional. So don't waste thinking in 1D, right? Don't waste that one-dimensional thought. Nature, you just don't see one-dimensional or monoculture type plantings in nature. They're very diverse. So understand that. And then the fourth rule in the weed control handout that I give my clients is trust diversity and be patient. If the blend is growing, it's working, right? If you maintain this routine, it only gets better. And that's probably the most common feedback I get with these diverse blends and going no-till is guys get so conditioned to turning the soil and planting brassicas or some really easy to grow crop that the first year that they switch to no-till and do a diverse blend, it looks completely different, right? Even if it grows really, really well, now all of a sudden you go from having this one-dimensional monocrop planting that looks so nice and clean to this kind of messy looking field. To me, that's a beautiful thing at this point, right? But I understand what I'm looking at now too. So you just have to trust that diversity and be patient because it just gets better and better every year. And then secondly, on that note is, the most noticeable changes will come year 2 or 3 after disturbance. So once that soil has some time to heal itself, then you start to see this big uptick or promotion of this growth, right? And there's I forget how that saying goes. When you talk about planting perennial plants, I think it's sleep, creep, and leap. You ever heard that before?
No, but that makes sense.
The first year, if you go plant a tree, a potted tree or something, or a perennial plant, the first year, most of the time those plants are just kind of adapting to the soil conditions and establishing their root system. The second year, you start to see a little bit more growth, but they're still kind of settling in and adapting, connecting with the network around them, that fungal network. And then the third year, you see this big leap in growth. And it's the same exact thing that we see when we're doing these no-till, no chemical food plot systems. Year 2, year 3 is when we see that big leap, and it just gets better and better every year after that. So follow those rules and you don't have to worry about the weeds, and you will have significantly better food plots. Any questions on that, Taylor, before I jump into the actual routine that we follow?
No, I think that's that was well said.
So our routine, again, it's based off of those soil health principles, and it works. And this is all designed to create maximum attraction in food plots, whether you're trying to look out your back window in your backyard and watch wildlife. And I know I say that, and I try to say it frequently because I think people just kind of overlook the fact that they have a big lawn in their backyard that really doesn't produce anything. But if you are not hosting pickup football games in your neighborhood on a regular basis, there's really no reason to have a big lawn in your backyard. And you could put it into a food plot or, a native planting of some sorts and benefit the wildlife a lot more. So either a backyard planting or a food plot, whatever your goal is to attract wildlife to a certain area, this food plot program that we run is designed to do just that. And in doing so, it's improving the soil health. But again, that soil health is directly responsible for the nutrition in the plants, and that nutrition of the plants is what's going to equate to attraction to the food plot. So however you want to start your food plot system with this program, you can start right now, start planning ahead right now, or wait until this fall. It just kind of depends on where you want to jump in the routine. But we always go with a warm season cover crop. So we have a summer blend. The blends, and I guess I haven't actually mentioned this before, but it's kind of an exciting announcement to me. But I actually created a food plot company with a land management group of ours that we worked with for the last few years, putting together some food plot blends. We actually worked with Green Cover Seed to develop these blends, and we've kind of been fine tuning them over time. But we have all these blends in place that fit this program, and it's worked out really well the last few years. So I'm excited to share that with the general public, so to speak, beyond just my clients that I've been mixing these batches for. So we always have a warm season cover crop. Our summer blend is called Thrive, but have a summer blend. It's a very diverse blend. And that blend we plant when the soil temps reach 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Excuse me. I just kind of chewed on my tongue there. When the soil temps hit 60 degrees Fahrenheit and are rising. So it's critical that it's still getting warmer. And it's not just, a day where it's warm and then it cools off. And when you're measuring soil temps, you want to measure about an inch below the surface. So soil temps at 60 degrees and rising, and that's usually going to be early to mid-May, maybe early June, just kind of depends on what the spring is like. We put that summer blend in, or if you're in an area with a shorter growing season or slightly cooler climate, we can start with a spring blend. Our spring blend is called Rise, and that one can be planted at 45 degrees and rising. So one thing that I will recommend, and actually if you're in a southern zone and you have poorer soils or you really want to maximize your food plots, you have the ability to put in a spring blend and then go into a summer blend and then go into your fall blend. But up here in the upper Midwest where we are, you kind of have to pick or choose between the summer blend or the spring blend. And the spring blend works really well for improving soils with low organic matter. But that blend can be planted at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So a little bit earlier in the season, that's a good thing to get in there before the weeds start to take off, or this native plants try to fill in the open space in your empty food plots if you didn't plant a cover crop last fall. So that one works well. But either way, having a warm season cover crop is the best thing you can do going through the summer. So then with that warm season cover, late in the summer, when the majority of that warm season cover is reaching sexual maturity, and ideally 6 to 8 weeks before a killing frost, so usually late July through August, that's when we're going to go in and we're going to plant our cool season crop, and then we're going to terminate the warm season crop. So again, there's many ways that you can do this. Ideally, if you can go in there with a no-till drill and plant into that warm season cover crop, and then about a week or so later, right around the time that those seeds are germinating and starting to poke up through the ground, then go in and roll down that existing warm season cover crop. That's going to give you the biggest window there before any weed competition tries to grow, where you're crimping that existing crop, and then the cool season crop can poke up through that thatch layer right away and outcompete any weeds. But it doesn't always work that way. When we're doing our cattle integrated systems, we're basically broadcasting the seed and then we're grazing those the same day or within a couple of days, and it kind of levels things out. But what'd you say, Taylor, when you mob graze your areas, you usually have about a week to 10-day window before it starts to bounce back. So as long as your seeds get integrated into the soil and germinate relatively quickly, then you shouldn't have much of an issue there.
Yeah, the only difference I do is I just seed, I broadcast or drill prior to them being there. So they end up doing the trampling and then driving the seed in the ground a little bit further too.
Yeah.
And usually fall food plots you can broadcast. I broadcast most of the time.
Yeah. Yep. And the big thing there is if you can time it when there's some moisture, that's the best thing, right? Those broadcasted seeds aren't going to germinate until they get some moisture. So that's something to keep in mind. I actually just did I think it was an interesting experiment. And I'll circle back to that in a second here. But so that's the program or the system there to rotate through, right? So we get towards late summer, and then we're putting in that fall or cool season cover crop. Our fall blend is called the harvest blend, and again, that's geared towards maximum attraction, but it also has those crops that are going to winter over and start growing next spring, and that's going to allow you to repeat the system. So those cool season crops, and I refer to a crop as our targeted species of plant, right? So that's going to attract the animals, but then it eventually becomes a cool season cover crop, and that's going to regrow next spring. And then once soil temps hit 60 degrees, then we start the process over with that summer blend, and then the summer blend matures and we go back into the fall blend. So same process though, when that fall blend or that cool season cover crop, the next spring, you want to terminate that just as it reaches sexual maturity. So it's going to be primarily rye that matures in that blend. So when it starts to produce those seed heads and they're in the dough state where they're soft, it's super easy to terminate. You can run it over, crimp it, and it dies pretty quickly. So, and it also creates a really, really good thatch layer. Now, the next thing is if you do want to do standing grains, and obviously we are not huge proponents of corn. We just talked about how we don't really like corn. But corn is a pretty attractive food plot, especially late in the season. I wouldn't suggest trying to plant corn to feed your deer through the winter, but to plant corn as a late season food plot attraction and then supplement your deer with good browsy habitat, that sets you up for really good success late into the year. And we actually put together a corn or standing grain blend. We call it the Provide blend. And all this information is on my website. If you go to theuntamedambition.com/food plots, you'll see all these seed blends on there, and they're broken down. You can see the contents of all those blends. I'm not going to go into too much detail on them right now, but you can check all that out. Actually, we're offering free shipping right now if you order before the end of the month. So if you're interested, go check that out. But the standing grain blend, this Provide blend, it's a balanced blend with corn and beans and sunflowers and all sorts of good stuff in there that balances out the soil demands. So, typically you can't plant corn multiple years in a row without having to put a significant amount of inputs into that system because it just pulls so much out of the soil. But with this blend, you can get away with that. You're still going to want to go in there and either broadcast or drill a fall or cool season cover crop into that standing grain blend late in the year so that you do have that winter crop or that cool season crop that's going to come back the next spring. And it's going to do best, to get away from chemicals. It's going to be best to plant the standing grain blend into an existing cover crop when the soil temps hit 60 degrees. So keep that in mind. But it's a great blend. It's super attractive. Actually, the last time I planted it, I had the most mature deer on our property hitting that food plot consistently throughout the whole late season. So I'm excited to do more of that. I've kind of went away from corn the last couple of years, but I've been playing around with it on some client properties due to their requests. And I think we finally got a good blend put together here. So it works out well. And that particular blend is a non-GMO open pollinated 85-day corn. So if you get it in the ground early enough, it'll be fully mature before the end of summer. So you can drill or broadcast your fall blend right into it. And basically double up your crops. You double up your attraction in those food plot areas. So that really maximizes those areas. But again, the biggest thing here with all these food plots is just to remember that nutrition equals attraction. And I probably sound like a broken record saying that, but I say it all day, every day to all my clients. I was actually just on a property yesterday, and they left about 2 acres of standing corn for late season hunting. The farmer that leases their cropland also leases the neighbor's cropland, and the neighbor left about 10 acres of standing corn. So his comment, this client's comment was, we left this corn, but it didn't really seem to matter because all the deer were on the neighbors. And that was largely in part to the fact that his habitat was lacking good browsy cover. And those deer really need that browse in the wintertime more than anything else. That's where they're going to get a lot of their nutrients from. They rely on that. 80 to 85% of a deer's diet comes from browse. So understand that even with the best food plots out there, they're only feeding on them 20% of the time. But those food plots are there to supplement nutrition and create attraction and consistent movement through certain areas. So they work as part of the bigger system. They shouldn't be the only sustenance on your property for your animals, because most people don't plant enough food plots to actually sustain all of the animals on the property. And then they run out early and then your deer starve. So don't look at them that way. But his comment on his standing corn not meaning anything, well, this is how you beat that, right? If you want to have standing corn that attracts more deer, deer are attracted to nutrient density, not aesthetics, right? So they don't care how pretty your plot is. They want to come in there and eat something that's going to sustain them. Those bucks especially need a lot of nutrients after the rut. If they don't have the nutrients after the rut, they die. Best case scenario, they just don't grow much for antlers the next year because they're so nutrient deficient and deprived. So having highly attractive food plots, again, nutrition equals attraction. Going with a non-GMO standing grain is going to outcompete your neighbor's GMO corn or beans significantly. Again, on average, 20 to 40% more nutrients in non-GMO crops versus the GMO counterpart. So keep that in mind. Again, I know most people listening to this podcast are probably not hitting the GMO crops that much, but if you're on the fence, that in and of itself should be enough to push you over to the better side. Let's just call it that, the chemical free side. So that's kind of the food plot program that we run in a nutshell. Again, just focusing on a warm season cover crop and then that fall crop. It all comes back to those 6 soil health principles: keeping the living root in the soil, keeping the soil covered, and minimizing disturbance are some of the most critical aspects of that. And then obviously if you can integrate animals into that, and obviously the diversity aspect too, right? Balancing out the soil demands and building up that soil nutrient content all comes from the diversity aspect. So that's all that. Again, all this information's on my website. So if you're looking for more info, or I went through that too fast or too slow, then you can find that on my website. But anything that you want to add to that, Taylor? Oh,
I would plant that Thrive summer blend for my summer warm season grazing.
Yeah.
That's very similar to what I plant.
Yeah, it's got the sorghums and millets and stuff in it. The other thing I really like about that Thrive summer blend, in this client property I was just on, they actually have quite a few beehives on there. He said that they, just as a hobby really, but he said that they're projected to harvest over 1,000 pounds of honey out of those hives this year. And that whole blend and this whole system in general, you go and roll that crop down and terminate it right when it's starting to flower. Those plants will push as much energy as they can to produce that flower, but they never really develop the seed head. All of your pollinators in the area can go in and benefit from those flowers still, and they're not going to those flowers and taking a bunch of herbicide or pesticides back to the hive with them. So that's a really cool blend. And then, yeah, to your note, that blend that has forage soybeans, iron and clay cowpeas, sun hemp, grain sorghum, foxtail millet, white millet, nitro radish, trophy rapeseed, purple top turnip, black oil sunflower, buckwheat, and then it's got some inoculants on there too. But it's a very diverse grazable blend. And that's how we're running our food plots wherever we can right now, right? Is we're running that through the summer, and then we're broadcasting into them or drilling into them and then grazing cattle on them for a short period of time. So whether you want to do a whole pasture of that or, a 1 acre, half acre, quarter acre food plot, doesn't really matter. You're going to have the same benefits. Just kind of comes down to the quantity of how much acreage you're going to supply those animals.
The last time I did corn, I actually went in and broadcasted when the corn was about like just over your knee in July, and planted everything early. I don't remember who told me to do that, but the theory was essentially that the seed would lay under the canopy of the corn and actually go it's dormant in a way, or unless you got an initial head start if the corn was short enough. And I actually did have success doing that.
Yeah, I can see that working.
Once the corn dies and everything kind of thins out, the sun gets down to the ground, those seeds then take off. But
yeah, I was gonna say I could see that working, or even if the seeds
because it sucks
germinate
broadcasting stuff in
tall
10-foot
corn.
tall corn.
Yeah, absolutely. But if with that blend, it's not going to be as thick of corn as what you're used to either. And
Right.
we can plant that with our Genesis drill with 7-inch rows because the corn's spread out a lot more, within that blend. So it's not 100% corn on corn on corn. Obviously, 7-inch rows would be way too tight to plant corn normally. So it works out. But yeah, having that cool season cover crop broadcasted into it's absolutely essential. What I wanted to mention, I just kind of did a half-cocked experiment the last couple weeks here to see. I'm always trying to look for more ways to improve blends, from the broadcastable standpoint there. And some of those seeds, peas and sunflowers in particular, are hard to broadcast and get them to germinate and grow before animals eat them. Rodents and birds love to eat those seeds. So what I actually did was I soaked them in water and then broadcast them. And my test was basically just in pots in my kitchen. But what I found was, so I did one pot. I didn't broadcast, or excuse me, I didn't soak any of the seeds of this blend. And then I laid it down. And then the other one I soaked for 6 hours and then laid it down. And then I soaked the rest for 24 hours. And then to simulate a thatch layer, I took some alfalfa hay and soaked it in water overnight and then laid it on top of that so it didn't just suck all the moisture out of the soil. And then for a few days, I just took a mister, like spritzer bottle, and sprayed instead of watering, just to kind of simulate dew or light rain. And the results were close to what I expected. The seed that I soaked for 6 hours germinated quite a bit sooner and grew quite a bit faster than the non-soaked seed. What I found interesting comparing those two was that the grains in those blends, or in that blend, and that was the Rise blend. I'm going to pull that up here quick. So that blend it's got a couple different clovers in it. The Balanza clover, crimson clover, spring forage peas, spring oats, beardless forage barley, triticale, trophy rapeseed, purple top turnip, black oil sunflower seed. And what I found was the batch that was not soaked at all, the sunflowers had a very low germination rate to begin with, and it took them a lot longer to germinate, and so did the peas. The grasses in there, the grains, the triticale, the barley, and the oats, those all germinated well, but not, they were delayed a little bit. But then after a few days after germination, they seemed to catch up to the other one. But the big thing there was just the major difference between like the sunflowers and the peas and even the clovers and how fast that they germinated being soaked for 6 hours in the water. Now, obviously soaking your seed in water isn't going to make it easier to spread by any means. So dumping it through a spreader might cause some problems. But if you have a small food plot or something, soaking it in water and then spreading it by hand, this is definitely a plausible solution to improve germination rates there. One thing I found interesting was the seed that I soaked for 24 hours actually seemed to stunt it and reduce the germination rate a little bit. So if you're going to try this, and I'll hopefully have some time to put together a little bit more detailed video. I documented it, took a bunch of pictures, and actually ran a time lapse of the process. But if you're going to try and do it, my mindset there was, okay, I'm going to go do food plots this afternoon. So I'm going to take that seed and I'm going to put it in a bucket of water and let it soak for 5 or 6 hours before I get out there, and then spread it down and roll or crimp my existing crop over the top of that, or graze it, whatever it may be. And it seemed to work. So first stage of the test. It's plausible, but I found it very interesting. And that's one of the things, we're with these seed blends, are trying to work on more broadcastable blends for both our cattle integrated systems and just the food plotter that doesn't have the equipment. And if I was going to go out today and buy one piece of equipment for food plotting, it would probably be a roller crimper or some sort of modified roller crimper of sorts, or a bunch of electric fence and some sheep. Both
Yeah.
beneficial. So, but on the food
Where would you
plot
get a
note,
roller crimper from?
well,
Do you have a
I'm
place?
actually I'm actually in the process of designing my own, um, a modified upgradable system that's significantly more cost effective than what's on the market.
Yeah, there isn't much.
No, I don't. I mean, I've heard, that Packer Max roller crimper I heard works fairly well, but I've also heard from people that have planted quite a few plots with it that it doesn't hold up, kind of falls apart over time, which makes sense because it's only like a 8-inch roller or something that's got to be turning a lot of times
Mm-hmm.
every time you go back and forth through your plot. And it's got a lot of weight sitting on it. So I don't think there is a real good solution. Obviously the bigger crimpers that what is like the Goliath crimper or something that RTP has, seems like a pretty well built solid crimper, but they're not cheap by any means. They're a couple $1,000 probably, and for most people that's just not feasible, especially if you're only planting a couple small food plots every year. So I'm working on a solution to it. Stay tuned. I'll have something ready to go early summer here by the time food plot season hits. So right now, if you want to get going on that food plot regiment, just focus on getting those cover crops in. And again, year one, if you're not in this routine, year one's going to require some form of disturbance. But also in year one, it's a good idea to do a soil test. And you can find that on my website as well if you don't have that resource available to you. We don't do typical soil testing anymore. And actually, we don't test soils that often anymore, usually just year one. But we do a soil health analysis versus a soil test. And the main reason for that is the soil health analysis is going to tell us a lot more about the biology of the soil and then actually what that soil needs to heal and feed that biology versus a typical, what they would refer to as a destructive soil test, which is really just going to tell you what types of fertilizers to add to your soil. And unless the soil's really bad, we're not adding any fertilizers. And if we are adding fertilizers, it's going to be an organic based fertilizer. But we don't add that unless we have to. And again, it really just depends on the nutrient contents of the soil. And the soil health analysis lets us know a lot more about those micronutrients in the soil and not just the NPK ratios and what synthetic fertilizers to add to that food plot to get one crop out of it. Our goal here is to heal that soil and move forward and improve it along the way. So if you need a soil test, you can find that on my website as well. One other thing that I wanted to note on the food plot side of things, because this is what I've been working on quite a bit the last few weeks here, is really maximizing your food plots. And by that I mean adding more surface area to them via trees and shrubs. So when you think about when we talked about that one-dimensional mindset, having diversity in your food plots is going to automatically increase the dimensions of that food plot, so to speak. But having trees and shrubs around those food plots, creating good edge habitat, it's the most productive habitat on your property, or should be. And having good edge habitat, I build what I refer to as these orchard edges, some of these orchard systems that we're building that produce food value for humans, even production food value for some properties, but even just on food plots, smaller scale, adding mass bearing trees and shrubs around your food plots is going to 3 to 5x the amount of surface area that you're harnessing the solar energy from the sun with. So now is a good time of year to be thinking about that, planning ahead, getting some of those trees in the ground. And my best advice for that is just start small, get a tree package or a couple tree packages, 5, 10, 20 trees, shrubs, so on, and get those planted. And if you're not ready for it, then don't order them yet. You know, there's some prep. You don't have to prep the ground, but you might have to remove existing vegetation. Maybe you have some invasives working into those edges. You need to peel those back. So plan ahead for that. But now is a good time of year to think about that, and obviously planting season for trees and shrubs is coming up real fast. Less than a month away here, and I'll be planting. I think I've got a couple thousand trees and shrubs on order right now, so it'll be busy. But it always pays off, and there's nothing more rewarding than looking back at some of those trees and shrubs you planted a few years down the road and seeing them grow, and you know, doing that with your kids is awesome too. Being able to look back, or hopefully be able to look back 20, 30 years from now and see a fully mature tree and how it developed and what it's brought to the ecosystem. And having that around those food plots just adds more diversity in the food types and cover types and all that stuff too. So very, very beneficial. And also this time of year is a good time of year to be out there pruning any existing fruit trees that you have. It's actually my project. If I get caught up on a couple things here in the next couple days, I need to run back to the farm and I'm going to pollard a few apple trees that are way overgrown, some just kind of crappy pasture apples, but the deer seem to love them. So I'm going to cut the tops of those off and force them to regrow a healthier system at a lower height, so we get more sun in some of these areas of the food plot, but also kind of remove any of the dead branches and stuff that have been growing in these unmanaged apple trees. So Taylor, anything you want to add to that?
Well, no, I mean, I think you've got it pretty much everything that I do. It's very similar to how you have everything outlined there.
Seems to make sense, right?
Yeah, it does. I think and I think it's important that we get to where what I was gonna say is I think you nailed it at one point where it's more of an aesthetics type issue with people. I would just, if you're going to be judging your food plots on aesthetics and just your property, make sure to judge it at all seasons of the year. Because I can promise you the aesthetics of my food plots in September probably weren't as pretty as they used to be. But right now, I think they're beautiful because there's a perfectly level mat on top of the soil. That's beautiful right now. There's no bare ground showing, nothing. It's like a spider web, because once all the snow piles on and packs everything down, you have essentially like a blanket over the ground. And if you go to a soybean field, say you just planted just soybeans, and it probably looked awesome in September, even maybe it looked awesome in December. It's completely bare. It's just exposed dirt. So if you have issues with the aesthetics, just judge your aesthetics at all times of the year.
And judge them based on those soil health principles, not what we've been trained to believe. And that's the big thing. You know, when you look at these food plot companies on the market, there's a big reason why they push brassicas. Big reason. You know, and even clovers. But the brassicas, they're easy to ship. It's a relatively low seed rate, so they can pack, you know, a quarter acre in a tiny can, and they're easy to grow. And at the end of the day, all these food plot companies really care about is that the seed that they sell you grows, because then you can't blame them for any failures. But I was scrolling through Facebook earlier today, and yeah, I don't know if you're part of the group or follow the group Food Plots for Whitetails on there, but man, if you want to get any expert opinions, just scroll through that page. It's always funny. I always have to just kind of bite my tongue and not comment, because there's a lot of really bad advice that goes through that. There's also some really good advice too, but probably more bad advice than good advice. And you can tell, and I know this because I've been in the industry long enough, right? I've worked in the outdoor industry for almost 15 years now, so I've heard all these slogans and campaigns from every food plot company out there. But that's basically what all these guys do. They just relay this information that's presented to them from some other food plot company, and then they just regurgitate it, but they don't actually know what's going on. So something to keep in mind. You know, again, weeds grow for a reason. They're trying to fix something in the soil. your clover plots are great. A perennial clover plot is great once you get it established, but it's not sustainable because you can't grow pure clover in soil for an extended period of time. It basically cannibalizes that soil because the carbon to nitrogen ratio is so out of whack. It's all nitrogen going in there and very little carbon. And your soil is primarily carbon based. So it depletes a lot of the carbon resources in that soil with all that nitrogen in there. And that's why you end up getting grasses and weeds and stuff that try to pop up in those clover plots all the time. And even if you mow it, you're still going to see that, or your clover just starts to thin out. And brassicas are the same way. I mean, the carbon to nitrogen ratio of pure brassicas isn't that great either. There's a lot more nitrogen in brassicas, and they break down really quick, which you see in your food plots, right? It's not like when spring rolls around that you have a thatch layer of leftover brassicas. Even if the deer don't eat it, you don't see that because it breaks down so quickly in the soil. So keep that in mind. Again, the diverse blends, that's the way to go. A question that I had from a customer not that long ago, he was asking for suggestions on what to plant in a food plot that was partially shaded. And I just told him a blend, right? And then I had another guy ask me what he recommended as a first time food plotter. And I said, a blend. The answer is the same for both of them, because if you don't really understand the situation, you don't understand the context, then you should be planting one of these diverse blends. And more often than not, you're going to see most of those plants survive and thrive, and some of them won't, just depending on the site conditions. But what you'll see, even when you have a really good field, is year to year, you're going to notice some of those plants in the blends seem to thrive better than other plants. As it's fixing the soil, they're going to do better. And then in time, things will change. If you plant the same blend year after year, you'll notice one year, one plant does better than the next. So planting a blend is the best way to go. You're going to get what you need out of it. And again, depending on the context and the site conditions, maybe not every single plant in that blend is going to do well, but enough of them will do well that it's going to accomplish your goal. So the blends are the way to go for sure. They just don't ship as nicely as a tiny little can with fancy packaging on it. So keep that in mind. But that's food plots. We're getting ready for it. I mean, get out there, map out the areas of your food plots. Start, if you haven't already done so, start peeling back some of those edges, creating some good brushy edges. That's a great way to screen those food plots. You don't want your deer to see in those plots. And if they're in the plot, you don't want them to see out of the plot. They're going to feel a lot safer in those food plots. So it's all part of that system. But right now is a perfect time to be out. If your ground's not frozen, you can pull those soil samples. And if you go to my website, all you do on there is just print off a sheet and dig up your own soil samples, send them into the lab. And then when the results come in, they send them to me, and then I'll connect with you and kick you an email with the explanation. If there's anything that you need to be aware of with those soil samples, we'll take care of that. I'll help you kind of read that analysis so it makes sense to you. And then get going. Get that cover crop in there. Either, disturb that soil in the spring and keep that cover crop throughout the year, or disturb it later this summer and then roll into that program next year. But if you let it go fallow from your fall planting into the spring and summer, then you're going to get all those weeds, and then you have to come back in and disturb the soil. So you're always going to be limited on the quality of that food plot every time you disturb the soil. Again, the longer you go without disturbing the soil, the better off you're going to be. And we don't have to worry about compaction with food plots, right? Or we shouldn't have to. So if you're in there doing food plots with equipment, don't do it when it's wet. But Taylor, you mentioned that warm March that we had. Then we ended up having that the drought year, one of the worst droughts that we had that year. That's another huge benefit of not disturbing the soil and doing a no-till with a cover crop and that thatch layer is every bit of moisture that you get goes into the soil and is held in the soil and used by that biology in the soil versus evaporating or running off. So there's so many benefits of following a system like this. And I certainly did not pioneer this system. I'm just kind of made fine tweaks that work for me and my clients over the years. But the system works, and it's all designed around the soil health principles, which were designed around natural systems. They mimic those natural systems. So they make sense. They've evolved billions of years. They've evolved. So let's not try to reinvent the wheel. Let's just
Yeah,
tweak it so it works better for us and in our
I think that's
situation.
the biggest thing is it is simple
Yeah.
in a way.
Yep. So with that, let's wrap it up. Again, closing thoughts. My philosophy is if you want to save the world, you have to start at home. And my weekly tip for improving yourself, your family, your yard, your community, etc., is think about these food plot systems. Think about all the systems that we are incorporating into our lives and how you can make them more efficient. I think we just talked about this for over an hour on how we can really why there's no excuse that we can't remove the chemical aspect of our food plot systems. As hunters, we are on the front line of conservation. And if you look up conservation, it'll say right in there, the preservation of resources, and our soil resources are the most important aspect of our life, which I would hope at this point anyone who's consistently listened to this podcast understands that message. But if you go into your food plotting with that mindset that our soil is the most precious, important resource that we have, and you are a frontline conservationist, then it just makes sense to do everything you can to conserve and improve that soil. So think about that. Think about improving the soil, prioritize the soil and that biology in the soil with everything that you do, uh, in your land management, food plots, your gardening, even your lawn. When you're improving your lawn, snow is melting, lawns look terrible right now. My lawn at the end of the driveway, they seal coated the road last fall, so there's all sorts of gravel and little rocks all over the lawn. So I'm gonna have to rake that off, and anywhere that road salt or salted sand got pushed on the lawn, there's probably gonna be some dead spots. But I'm not gonna go in there and spray a bunch of chemicals on it and try to make this perfect monoculture of cool season invasive alien grasses. I'm probably going to go in there actually and frost seed some clover into it and get some other perennials and things that pollinators can benefit from, because you can bet that when May rolls around, I'm not mowing my lawn. Any excuse that I can get to not mow my lawn, I'll take advantage of it. But how about you, Taylor? Any tips?
I would say the most important thing about the soil health thing, and if you want to look into it a little bit further, is the living roots in the soil. We want to maximize the amount of days that living roots are active in the soil, and that's the importance of mixing cool season and warm season plants together, and that's a key component of soil health. So if you just look at that one principle, that would mean that you would never just plant a monocrop warm season plant that only grows for 5 months. And just start breaking down those principles of soil health and just kind of work it into how you're doing things. And you can work it in slowly over time, change things one by one. But living roots in the soil is kind of is an important one, because that eliminates a lot of the issues that we have. Living roots in the soil, you wouldn't spray herbicide over a field then, as you'd kill everything. So that's a good one. Think about that. As far as business wise, we have a homestead 18-acre farm near Hillsboro, kind of by Wildcat State Park. And then we will also have beef and pork quarters and halves and wholes coming available. Probably start selling those in April, May, with a late July pickup. So if anyone's ever interested in that. For the real estate stuff, go to driftlessregionland.com. And then for the meat stuff, go to sideyhollowfarms.com.
Can I pre-order that?
Yeah.
There you go.
Pretty much all pre-orders.
There you go. Good way to account for your protein and high quality nutrition for the year. Just get that order in and one thing off the table. I did, well, actually, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago that we talked about ordering chickens and stuff like that? I ordered a couple batches of my chickens. I've got a handful of pigs coming here.
Nice.
Actually, yeah, on that note, I walked another property in Hillsborough area, not far from our farm actually, and it was well, okay, I won't go down a major rabbit hole on this because I definitely could, but it was interesting. This property had been walked and had a, I wouldn't call it a habitat plan by any means, but it was walked by a whitetail. And for those of you not watching, I'm throwing up air quotes because that's just kind of what I do when I say whitetail consultant, because I think whitetail consulting's a joke. But a whitetail consultant walked this property and put together a habitat improvement plan. And the reason I say it's not really a habitat improvement plan is because when I walked the property, I made the property owner very aware that about 40 acres of the property was entirely overrun with mature invasive plants, like really, really bad, solid, brushy, nasty cover made up of
The hinge
almost an,
cutting.
no, they didn't really do a whole lot of hinge cutting, and that was actually the main reason they brought me in. Was they weren't sure where to start with that, and they had done some hinge cutting and didn't have great results. And then of course I show up and tell them that I'm wouldn't recommend hinge cutting, here or there, maybe to create a barrier or a little bit of backing cover, but not to go crazy with it. But no, this was like an old, I'm guessing it was at one time either an old farm field, then maybe converted into a pasture, but it's like an old apple orchard now, like old, you know, pasture apples. I reference just kind of your typical apple tree that grows as a pasture apple, but kind of an old apple orchard area with really, really bad soil and almost entirely multiflora rose, autumn olive, and honeysuckle. Multiflora rose vining and growing up to the tops of some of these 20-foot tall apple trees, autumn olive everywhere, honeysuckle everywhere. And I'm not gonna, again, I'm not here to sling mud, but I don't need to name names. The previous consultant on this property is a big proponent of leaving autumn olive and most other invasives for that matter. But point being, he asked me, and this is the question I get all the time. This is what really has driven me down this path. He asked me, well, what's the best way to get rid of those invasives and improve that soil up there? And I said, well, the best thing to do would be for us to put about 20 pigs in there for the summer. And at first he kind of rolled his eyes and was a little hesitant. And then I talked through it a few times, and he's on board. He's 100% on board. And actually what we're going to do in that spot, because I'm not 100% sure how those pigs are going to handle the multiflora rose with as thorny as it is. But what we're going to do this summer is we're going to run some tests and definitely going to document it all and bring everyone along, both the listeners here and anyone who follows my YouTube channel, which hopefully at some point here I'll actually produce more video content on there. But we're going to do a couple of smaller test plots, and we're going to brush hog or mulch everything in an area and then put the pigs in there and basically let them feed on the regeneration and fertilize the soil. And then we're going to do another area where we're just going to brush hog the perimeter to put the fencing in and just let them have at it and see how much of it they actually mitigate or destroy on their own. But the biggest factor there is that they're going to reset that vegetation, and we're still going to have to supplemental feed them, right? We're going to put a feeder in there, self feeder and water and such, but they're going to be cycling and putting a lot of nutrients back into that soil. And that's the root problem there. Is if we go in there, we just brush hog all those invasives down, there's tons of seeds sitting in the seed bank waiting to grow. And because the soil is so poor, very few native plants are going to start to grow there. So the invasives will just take over again. And then we'll be back in there in a year or two, brush hogging everything again. Or, obviously there's other alternatives there. We can go in there and we can brush hog it all down and wait for it to regenerate for a couple of years and then go in and spray it and treat it with a low dose of herbicide. But we're still not solving the root issue there, which is the poor soil, the over-farmed, depleted soils that are in there that, were probably farmed very heavily a couple hundred years ago. I mean, there's an old farmstead on this property, and I think this is one of their main field areas. So it'll be interesting, but that's our goal. And then we're also putting together a long-term plan to utilize some of the cattle on the neighboring properties and graze them through that system every so often to continue to improve the nutrients. So it's interesting. It's going to be fun. And I guess what I'm getting at is I'm not, or you're not the only one who's going to have a bunch of pork at the end of the summer. So,
Nice.
but maybe I'll just sell you the pigs and you can deal with it because I don't have the bandwidth to sell pork right now. I just want the pigs to do some of the heavy lifting or the labor side of things for me. So it'll work out.
Well, make sure you're ready for them because they can be they're escape artists.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. We got to get them trained and get them trained to respect the electric fence. We're going to do all netting, electric netting. So at least to start, kind of go from there. But anyways,
Well, maybe we can talk about grazing pigs a little bit more in depth next time.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I've got all my stuff together in preparation for that. So I think it definitely would be worth an episode to discuss that. So anyway, I've got to wrap up a few things here and get outside and get some sunshine, soak up this beautiful spring weather. So until next time.
Have a good one, man.
All right, take care.